Some fairies appear before us without our knowing. They are camouflaged within their surroundings or shimmering in the light of the sun or moon. Others appear before us clearly in colours that we recognise. In this video, let's look at just a few true sightings of fairies of yellow, red, blue, white, green, and opalescent. There is a little stream which passed the side of my grandmother's house in Glenade. This stream leads to a cave which is hidden in the face of a rock. There was a large flagstone which in olden days served as a door but is now covered with grass. Well, my grandmother told of a dog which was often seen at the mouth of this cave. This dog was said to be a fairy hound. He was of a yellow colour with gleaming yellow eyes, and he used to lead people who were out at night into the cave because they would mistake the light from the cave for a house in the distance. There is a story told about my grandfather and some neighbours who went into the cave. They had no means of having a strong light while they were in the cave. The only light they had in the cave was a candle because there were no flash lamps in those days. But my grandfather brought a ball of rope about 100 yards long to find his way back. But when they got about 30 yards into the cave, the light went out, the candle went out, and they couldn't go another step. So they returned to the mouth of the cave using the rope, but found that their friend, Mick Hoban, was missing. They looked everywhere, but they couldn't find him. So some of the men went to Mick's home, thinking that he might have gone on before them, but he wasn't there, so they returned to the cave. The men who had stayed there at the cave told them that he hadn't come out. Well, they went back into the cave as far as they could, but they couldn't find their friend. In shock and bewilderment, they had to go home without him. Well, a week or so later, something very strange occurred. A man came out of a little iron door, which was never opened before, in the town hall in Kilkenny. Some men had been passing the town hall when they heard a frantic rapping at the iron door. So they went in, and with the help of a blacksmith, they opened up the door. And there, stood before them, was a little yellow man with gleaming yellow eyes. Patrick Walsh and John Byrne said that he was certainly not their friend, but since then have come to believe that the fairies kept their friend and sent a fairy man in his stead. No person has ever tried to get into that cave from that time onwards. That cave goes through the Tully Mountain, and it is said to be a fairy pass. I have seen them, those which are shining and those which are opalescent. The shining beings appear to be lower in the hierarchies. The opalescent beings are more rarely seen and appear to hold positions of great authority. The opalescent beings seem to be about 14 feet in stature, though I do not know why I attribute to them such definite height since I had nothing to compare them with, but I have always considered them as much taller than our race. The shining beings seem to be about our own height or just a little taller. Irish people and seers do not usually speak of the Sidhe as being little, but as being tall. An old schoolmaster in the west of Ireland described them to me from his own sightings as tall, beautiful people, and he used some Gaelic words which I took as meaning that they were shining with every colour. I've discovered a few rare and curious sightings of fairy not dressed in red, but as red. which I'd like to share with you. The first comes to us from the west of Ireland. My father told me that one night he was crossing this road and he paused a moment and turned to the wall to adjust his shoe. When he turned back again, there was something running through the field beside him that was the size of a yearling calf, and he could see by the moonlight that it was black. Well, it ran across the road just near where he stood, and there was a sound like chains hanging off it. When it came to that rock with the bush on it next to the road, it stopped and stood staring at him, and he could see there was a bright red light shining in its mouth. Then it just disappeared. Two curious tales now from Wales. Egbert Williams was a pious young gentleman of Denbighshire, then at school, and he was one day playing with three girls, one of whom was his sister. Near the stile, beyond Lanewood House, they saw a company of 15 or 16 coblynau engaged in dancing madly. They were in the middle of the field, about 70 yards from the spectators, and they danced something after the manner of Morris dancers, but with a wildness and swiftness in their motions. They were clothed in red and wore red handkerchiefs spotted with yellow wound around their heads. And a strange circumstance about them was that although they were almost as big as ordinary men, yet they had unmistakably the appearance of dwarfs, and one could call them nothing but dwarfs. Well, presently one of them left the company and ran towards the group near the stile, who were directly scared thereby and scrambled in great fright to go over the stile. Barbara Jones got over first, then her sister, and as Williams was helping his sister over, they saw the coblynau closing upon them. Williams had barely got over the stile when the coblynau's hairy hand came down heavy on the stile. He then stood leaning on it, gazing after them as they ran, with a grim, copper red-coloured countenance and a fierce look. The young people ran to Lanewood House and called the elders out, but though they hurried quickly to the field, the fairies had already disappeared. There is a well-authenticated tradition of a race of beings who, in the middle of the 16th century, inhabited the great dark wood in Merionethshire, and who were called the Red Fairies. They lived in dens in the ground, had fiery red hair and long, strong arms, and it was known that they would steal sheep and cattle by night. There are cottages near the great dark wood with scythes in the chimneys, which were put there to keep these terrible beings out. One Christmas Eve, a knight named Baron Owen headed a company of warriors who violently assailed the Red Fairies and found them to be flesh and blood. The Baron hung 100 of them, but spared the women, one of whom begged hard for the life of her son. The Baron refused her prayer, whereupon she opened her breast and shrieked, "This breast has nursed other sons than he, who will yet wash their hands in thy blood, Baron Owen." Not very long thereafter, the Baron was waylaid at a certain spot by the sons of the fairy woman, and delivered her promise. Her sons washed their hands in his warm and reeking blood in fulfilment of their mother's threat, and to this day that spot goes by the name of the Baron's Gate. There lived an old woman in the townland of Cornish who was very poor. One day, when the wind was blowing fierce, she thought that her house would be blown in, and she started to pray fast. In a moment, a little red fairy came to the door with a goose upon its arms. "Here, take this goose," said he, "and keep her well. It is a stormy season." The goose soon laid an egg, and the woman fed well that day. So it was the woman's life prospered. She went on to live in such style afterwards that the people began to treat her very well. She got a maid to wait upon her, and she got prouder and prouder every day. The only fault she found in the goose was that she used to make too much noise. Each time the goose laid an egg, it seemed to cackle louder than the time before. At last the old woman said that the goose had her driven mad. She threw the pan and the kettle and everything she could leave her hands upon at the poor goose. The stricken goose flew through the house and filled it with her cries. Suddenly the door opened, and the little red fairy who had brought the goose again appeared. He spoke a few angry words to the old woman and then picked up the bird and left. At once the windows of her house were blown in, and before long she found herself as poor as she had been the day the red fairy brought her the goose. Black Annis is believed to dwell in the Dane Hills in Leicestershire, England. She has been described, rather unflatteringly, as a cannibal hag. Oh, she has blue skin and iron claws, and she lives in a cave. But Black Annis is not one for hibernation and slow digestion. Oh, no, she has a healthy appetite and she needs to eat regularly, but she prefers, if possible, not to be seen. So she lurks just inside the entrance to her cave and leaps out whenever a stray lamb or small child is passing nearby. But it's not only small prey. With her iron claws, she can take down deer and even cattle, so she latches onto them with these iron claws and drags them into the cave where she devours them. Now don't be thinking that she couldn't possibly bring down a deer or cattle. Her iron claws are fierce. In fact, it's believed that she digs out her cave out of the side of the hill using only her nails. Well, there is a really fascinating account told by a child who was evacuated to Leicestershire in December 1941 during the Second World War. Black Annis lived in the Dane Hills. She was very tall and had a blue face and long white teeth, and she ate people. She only went out when it was dark. My mum told me that when she ground her teeth, people could hear her in time to bolt their doors and keep well away from their windows. That's why we don't have a lot of windows in Leicestershire cottages. She can only get an arm inside. My mother says that that's why we have the fire and chimney in a corner. The fire used to be on the earth floor once, and people slept all round it until Black Annis grabbed the babies out the window, as they had no glass at that time. When Black Annis howled, you could hear her from 5 miles away, and then even the poor folk in the huts would fasten skins across the window and put witch herbs above it to keep her away. Oh, can you imagine the sound of her grinding teeth? It was probably a sign that she was hungry or on the hunt, I guess. It seems in earlier days that she could roam quite freely under the darkness of night and stalk houses. She was probably very familiar with all the occupants of each cottage and which families would visit other families at night. It must have been very frustrating for her when the central fire was moved into the corner of the cottage and away from her arm's length through the windows. But if there is one thing we know about fairies, it's that they are good at adapting, evolving to suit the changing world. I can't help wondering if there is only the one black anise, or there are many scattered throughout hills and mountains all over the United Kingdom. I suspect there are. They appear to be skilled in concealment and stealth. Given how distracted and noisy we are these days, it would be fairly easy for her to move about quite freely. As she is described as looking like an old hag, and we all know what that means, don't we? Thin, grey, dishevelled, sickly looking, she might pass for an old woman, except for one giveaway, her blue skin. Now that would be hard to explain. Well, given we know where black anise dwells, it should be fairly easy to avoid her, but as with any of the fairy folk, they are unpredictable. We just don't know where they could be. There may be few sightings these days, but we would be foolish to believe that that means black anise is gone. Always remember, fairies are canny folk, so I wouldn't write her off just yet. Well, let's go underground. The blue cap is a fairy that dwells in underground mines and has the appearance of a small blue flame. It is well established and well believed by miners all over that if miners treat a blue cap with respect, it will not only lead them to rich deposits of minerals, but also forewarn miners of imminent danger, such as a potentially deadly cave-in. But the blue cap didn't just float around looking beautiful. They worked hard. Sometimes miners would see the flickering blue flame of the blue cap settle on a full tub of coal and transport it as though impelled by the sturdiest sinews, which is to say, with great strength. Can you imagine how helpful this would have been to the hard-working miners? But the blue caps didn't do this work just out of the goodness of their hearts. They expected payment. Now, some miners would leave food or drink out for the blue cap, which is lovely and no doubt, but the blue cap expected to be paid a working man's wage, equal to that of the average putter, which is the fella who pushes the wagons. That's a hell of a job, isn't it? Blue cap would accept not more or less than this average wage, and payment was always left in a quiet corner of the mine. That's fascinating, isn't it? And it demonstrates just how seriously the miners felt about their fairy companions, the blue cap. There was an account of the blue cap published in the Colliery Guardian in May 1863. Take a look at this. The supernatural person in question was no other than a ghostly putter, and his name was Blue Cap. Sometimes the miners would perceive a light blue flame flicker through the air and settle on a full coal tub, which immediately moved towards the Rollyway, as though compelled by the sturdiest sinews in the working. Industrious blue caps required, and rightly, to be paid for his services, which he moderately rated as those of an ordinary average putter. Therefore, once a fortnight, Blue Cap's wages were left for him in a solitary corner of the mine. I'm so intrigued by the Blue Cap. These aren't some fly-by-night fairy. There is widespread belief in the Blue Cap by a great many people over a long period of time. Ordinary, well-balanced working people. But again, as with black anise, Times have changed, and there are no longer busy mines filled with hundreds of miners. Those days are behind us, for now at least. So I wonder, what does the blue cap do now? Do they miss human interaction? Do they ever venture out of the mines? Do they take some other form when they're above ground? And also, why blue? The last blue fairy we'll take a peek at today is a curious one, known as Blue Birches and sometimes Blue Breeches. He was well known to dwell in the county of Somerset in England. Now there is one particular fairy of this type who made a name for himself. He lived with a shoemaker and his family on the Blackdown Hills in the county of Somerset. This family sound like they were wonderful, actually. If only more people could accept fairy folk as they did. But sadly, that still doesn't mean that we're heading for a happy ending here. This wonderful family took him for a harmless hobgoblin who liked to play daily pranks on the household. But it was the son of the cobbler who came to know this fairy best of all. In fact, it sounds like they became grand old friends, and although he was said to appear in many shapes and forms, it was this boy who saw the fairy in what was widely believed to be his true physical state, looking similar to that of an old and haggard man who always wore blue birches or breeches. This tale dates from the end of the 19th century and is recorded as having been told to Mrs. Ruth Tongue by her schoolfellows in 1909 and also by a group of harvesters in Trull, Somerset in 1907. The cobbler and his family took all the pranks in good part. When heavy steps were heard descending the stairs and a wisp of blue mist drifted across the room, the cobbler only said, "Never mind old Blue Birches, he never do no harm." And he would proudly boast how Blue Birches ran across the room like a little blue pig and jumped into the duck pond without making a splash, and how when they were coming back late from market, he would set the house all aglow to make them think it was on fire. But one day the cobbler told his tales to the wrong person, one of the church parsons, who took Blue Birches to be the devil himself and soon brought along another church parson to banish this fairy. So it was, they came up and found an old white horse grazing by the duck pond. "Who's that?" the parson asked the little boy. "That be old Blue Birches, sir," said the boy. "Can you put a bridle on him?" asked the parson. The boy was proud to show the parson how friendly Blue Birches was and placed the bridle over his head. At once, both the parsons said together,
"Depart from me, you wicked!"
Blue Birches plunged into the pond and never came out again, at least not in so friendly a form. There was a fishing spot out off Galway where fish were known to be very plentiful, and many fishermen used to fish there after 12 o'clock at night. One night an old man stood just looking out over the sea before he entered his boat, and he saw a white fairy boat coming in to the place where the fish were known to be plentiful. The man decided not to take his boat out that night, but returned home and told of what he had seen. This old man, this fisherman, knew 6 men who were determined to go out the following night, and he went to them and warned them that it wasn't safe on account of his having seen the white fairy boat, but they did not heed his advice. That night, the 6 men were watched as they sailed out to the fishing spot. Soon, the white fairy boat appeared and it swept their boat away. They were never seen again. There was a man who lived in the village of Cave Town in County Roscommon who was known as a great hunter. There was a little wood near his home, and he went fowling in this wood almost every night. Well, one night, this man was walking down a little road through the wood, and on crossing a bridge, he saw a white fairy woman stood before him. He stopped at once and decided to try and walk past her on one side, but found he was unable to pass her. He couldn't move forward. So he did the only thing he could and turned and made his way back home. He returned to the wood later that night and again found the white fairy woman was still standing at the edge of the bridge. Once again he turned and went home, having decided that this time he would return with his gun. Well, thankfully, he was talked out of this by his friends, and soon after the events of that night, the man went to America and lived a long, prosperous life. Now, many who knew the man believed that this was because he spared the life of the fairy woman. I was once speaking with my friend Stephen of our personal experiences with fairies, and he pointed to a rocky knoll in a field not far from where we were sitting, just outside his home, and he said, "I saw a dog with a bright white ring around his neck just by that hill there. And the oldest men round Galway, well, they've seen him too, for he has been here 100 years or more. He is a dog of the good people, you see, and only appears at certain hours of the night." I was once at a wake. It was late at night and I'd stepped out of the house to get some fresh air. It must have been around midnight. Well, I saw, running up and down the neighbouring field, a woman with a strange white light in her hand. I called my daughter to come out of the house to witness the sight with me, but she could see nothing. But all the while, the woman dressed in white was in the field, shaking the white thing in her hands and running back and forth as fast as you or I could wink. One night, John Hennigan, who lives in Kilvolan, and his wife had come in from visiting neighbours and had gone straight to bed. Shortly afterwards, John heard a knock at the door. It was very late, so he took his gun with him and went out to see what was in it. And what did he see as he stood at the door? But 4 bright white dogs outside his house. As soon as he saw the dogs, he closed the front door and went back to his room. Looking out the window, he saw that the dogs were standing at his gate, and he told his wife to get up and take a look at them. The 2 of them stood at the window and saw that the dogs, instead of leaving, were standing up on their back legs, grinning broadly back at them. After that night, the dogs disappeared and were never seen. Some few weeks before Christmas of 1910, at midnight on a very dark night, my friend and I, who were both 23 years of age at the time, were on horseback on our way home from Limerick. When near Listowel, we noticed a light about half a mile ahead. At first, it seemed to be no more than a light in some house, but as we came nearer to it, and it was passing out of our direct line of vision, we saw that it was moving up and down, to and fro, diminishing to a spark, then expanding into a yellow, luminous flame. Before we came into Listowel, we noticed 2 lights about 100 yards to our right, which resembled the light seen first. Suddenly, each of these lights expanded into the same sort of yellow, luminous flame, about 6 feet high by 4 feet broad. In the midst of each flame we saw a radiant being having human form. Presently, the lights moved toward one another and made contact, whereupon the two beings in them were seen to be walking side by side. The beings' bodies were formed of a pure, dazzling radiance, white like the radiance of the sun, and much brighter than the yellow light or aura surrounding them. So dazzling was the radiance, like a halo round their heads, that we could not distinguish the countenance of the beings. We could only distinguish the general shape of their bodies, though their heads were very clearly outlined, because this halo-like radiance, which was the brightest light about them, seemed to radiate from or rest upon the head of each being. As we travelled on, a house intervened between us and the lights, and we saw no more of them. It was the first time we had ever seen such phenomena, but in our hurry to get home, we were not wise enough to stop and make further examination. I've seen more than one death candle. I saw one death candle right here in this room where we are sitting and talking. The death candle took an untrodden course from the house, across the fields there, and to the graveyard. And when a death occurred in the family soon afterwards, our aunt insisted that the corpse should be carried by exactly the same route. So the road was abandoned and the funeral went through the ploughed fields to the graveyard. The death candle appears like a patch of bright light, and no matter how dark the room or place is, everything in it is as clear as day. The candle is not a flame, but a luminous mass, lightish green or blue in colour, which dances as though borne by an invisible agency, and it sometimes rolls over and over. Near here, a light as big as a pot was seen, and rays shot out from it in all directions. Our neighbour saw the light when going along the road near Naveem. It was the death light of old Dr. Harris, and it was lightish green in colour. In this region of Cornwall, there are two kinds of pixies. One purely a land-dwelling pixie, and the other a pixie that dwells on the sea strand between high and low water mark. The land-dwelling pixie are usually thought to be full of reckless, mischievous fun, but they do no serious harm to anyone. It is known that they possess a green balm made from herbs gathered from Cerris Moor. Now, certain local people were favoured by the pixies, and on occasion the pixie folk would rub this green balm on their eyes, which allowed them to join the pixies in their revels. Those who were touched by this green balm told that while with the pixies, time slipped away very rapidly, but on returning, no time had passed at all. No other after effects of this green balm were ever reported. The Coo She is a fairy dog of the Highlands and is distinctly different from other Celtic fairy hounds, as it is dark green in colour. In times past, the Coo She was commonly seen running wild on the beaches and near the farms and cottages of local people. It has no fear of people at all, and is described as being as large as a 2-year-old bullock with a shaggy long tail coiled up on its back. Its feet are enormous and as broad as a man's. Indeed, its great footmarks were often seen in mud, snow, or sand, but it was seen gliding along silently, moving in a straight line. There was a man coming across the links near Canavara Hill who saw a large green dog resting on the side of a sandbank. Immediately alarmed, he turned around and took another road home. But the sight of this green hound occupied his every thought, so the next day he gathered up his courage and returned to the sandbank to examine it. He found on that sandbank the marks of a dog's paw, but no ordinary paw. They were as large as the spread of his own palm. So he steeled himself and followed the huge footmarks until he lost them on the plain. This offered no reassurance to his mind, though. Given how close he was to it, the man was certain the dog had been aware of his presence. It is true the dog had taken no notice of him, but its colour and size convinced the man it was no earthly beast. And every day after, he trembled at the thought of stumbling upon it a second time. Now the cry of the Cooshie, well, it struck terror in the hearts of locals, as it was a sign it was hunting. But it did not bark. Instead, it bellowed 3 tremendous bays which were so loud they could be heard by ships far out at sea. One woman reported that when a young girl, she had heard on a beach on the north shore of Tiree the baying of the Cooshie. Her father's house was at one end of this beach, which stretched a full mile in length. It was after nightfall, she said, and she was playing on the sand under the light of the moon, when she was suddenly startled by a loud sound, like the baying of a dog, only much louder, coming from the other end of the beach. The girl stopped and looked down the beach at where the sound had come, and after just a moment she heard a second bellow. Then, as the sound of the second call echoed past, her father appeared suddenly at her side, grabbed her hand and ran her back to the house. Her father told her, "The Cooshie is so fast, by the time it bellowed a third time, it would have been upon her." There is a natural recess in the rocks on a shore in Tiree, to which tradition has given the name of the bed of the fairy dog. It is opposite a massive low-water rock, over which the sea breaks with terrible violence in stormy weather. The loneliness and the wildness of the spot is well known, and people rarely ventured there. But one day, a shepherd in Lorne came to the top of a rock overlooking this shore, and in a nest or a lair below him, he saw 2 pups with dark green fur to their backs and sides. They were larger in features and visibly longer than his own dogs. The shepherd knew at once what he was looking at. His dogs fled in fright, and he followed them seconds later, desperate to get away, before the mother hound appeared back to her lair. I hope you've enjoyed this look at fairies of varying colours. If something in this video tickled your interest, be sure to give it a thumbs up and check you're subscribed so you don't miss any future videos. Until next time, stay curious and be kind. Cheerio!